Imagine a world without women, not a sudden disappearance but a reality where the feminine essence never existed. From the dawn of humanity, the very foundation of our species would be incomplete. As Plato suggested in his theory of forms, every ideal has a necessary complement. Without one half, the whole is distorted. Aristotle wrote about the balance of virtues, many of which are relational. How could they arise without feminine presence? Religious texts across traditions, from the Torah to the Bhagavad Gita, emphasize the sacred interplay of masculine and feminine energies in creation. The Psalms speak of harmony and balance in nature, and the Christian understanding of creation shows humanity as male and female, made to complement one another. Literature, too, reflects this duality. Shakespeare's plays, from Macbeth to Twelfth Night, explore the interplay of gender, power, and human emotion. Jane Austen's novels often hinge on the subtleties of feminine influence shaping society. Imagine, then, a world without these voices, without the literary and cultural depth they bring. Philosophers like Simone de Beauvoir remind us that the other is essential to identity. Without women, the concept of man is unanchored. Carl Jung emphasized the anima and animus, the inner feminine in every man, which would be absent. How would morality evolve without nurturing, empathy, and relational insight? What of creativity, music, poetry, and art? Would these even exist, or would expression be flattened into monochrome logic? Even religious rituals, often led or inspired by women, would vanish. The ancient Greek mysteries celebrated feminine archetypes. Without them, what symbolic frameworks remain? Humanity, at its core, is relational, and half of that relationality is gone. Love, compassion, and guidance, these would lack their full expression. Could society even conceive of beauty without feminine insight? From Augustine to Aquinas, theology speaks of the balance in creation. Without women, would our understanding of God itself shift? Every philosophical, literary, and spiritual lens shows the interdependence of genders. This is not a tale of blame or fault, it is a meditation on absence. What remains when one half of the human story is missing? This question sets the stage for our inquiry, for the thought experiment that follows. It is not just a hypothetical, it is a reflection on identity, culture, and the essence of being human. Today we imagine a world incomplete, and through this imagination, we come to understand the invisible, profound role women play in shaping humanity. What would it mean to live in a mirror of ourselves, reflecting only half the light? What would remain of our society, our art, and our souls in such a world? These are the questions we will explore. This is not merely a biological question, it is a profound inquiry into what humanity would become without half of its participants. As Aristotle emphasized, humans are social animals, and our societies are structured by complex interactions between genders. What happens when one foundational relationship is removed? Simone de Beauvoir wrote extensively about women as the other, and here, without women, the mirror for male identity disappears entirely. Plato's dialogues often explore balance and duality, suggesting that existence is defined by the interplay of opposites. If one pole is absent, what remains of our understanding of virtue, justice, or harmony? Religious traditions underscore this necessity. In Hindu cosmology, Shakti, the feminine energy, is essential for creation. Without her, Brahma's work is incomplete. Christian theology presents Eve as integral to the moral and spiritual journey. Her absence would fundamentally alter humanity's story. Literature similarly reflects the tension and complementarity of genders. In Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte examines how passion and nurture interact. Without women, the emotional texture of such narratives vanishes. Jane Austen's social critiques show how women shape society, influence decision-making, and transform communities. Ursula K. Le Guin, in The Left Hand of Darkness, experiments with genderless societies, revealing what is lost when duality is erased. Carl Jung's anima archetype would be vacant in every man, leaving inner psychological balance disrupted. Philosophy of ethics, from Kant to Gilligan, relies on empathy, often rooted in relational care. How would a single-gender society develop moral reasoning? The history of art and music, shaped by female patrons, muses, and creators, would be profoundly altered. Religious rituals, celebrations, and spiritual guidance, often led or inspired by women, would be absent. Would humanity find substitutes, or would emotional and spiritual depth diminish? The stories we tell ourselves, foundational myths, and cultural narratives rely on the interplay of male and female perspectives. Without the feminine lens, narratives flatten, and nuance is lost. Could leadership, collaboration, and governance evolve without complementary insight? Feminist philosophy and theology alike show that women's presence shapes societal ethics and justice. Without this guiding counterbalance, would aggression dominate over compassion, conquest over cooperation? Our identity is relational, and identity without contrast risks becoming hollow. What would art, literature, and culture look like in a world of only one perspective? Could creativity flourish, or would monotony prevail? We confront uncomfortable truths. The absence of women is not simply a missing gender, it is a missing dimension of human potential. By imagining this absence, we are forced to appreciate the depth and necessity of feminine contributions to every facet of existence. Today, we explore this world not to judge but to understand what is essential for humanity itself. In a world without women, natural reproduction would be impossible. The human species would have to rely entirely on technology or alternative biological processes. Parthenogenesis, or artificial reproduction, would replace the natural cycle, transforming birth into a technical, almost mechanical event. In Genesis, creation is described as a collaborative act of God, male and female combined. Without the feminine, creation loses its wholeness and sacred symmetry. Philosophically, Aristotle saw reproduction as the union of male and female principles, necessary for natural balance. Without one, the teleology of life shifts entirely. Simone de Beauvoir noted that women have historically been positioned as life-givers and culture shapers. Their absence erases both biological and societal continuity. Jane Austen's novels emphasize the familial and social structures that depend on women, highlighting how central they are to stability and development. Mary Wollstonecraft argued for women's vital role in moral and rational education. Without them, human intellectual and ethical growth would falter. The concept of nurture, present in Buddhism as compassion and care, would be radically limited. Would a machine ever replicate the emotional intelligence that human mothers and women provide? Even literary archetypes, from Shakespeare's Ophelia to the Bronte sisters' heroines, show how female presence shapes male identity and cultural output. Ursula K. Le Guin's speculative fiction explores worlds without traditional gender, highlighting both potential and limitation. Carl Jung's theory of the anima suggests that the inner feminine guides creativity, intuition, and moral insight in men. Without it, psychic development is incomplete. Neuroscientific studies, as in Luann Brisendine's The Female Brain, show that hormonal influences from women affect social cohesion and empathy in society. These would vanish entirely. Ethical reasoning, from Kantian universality to Gilligan's care ethics, relies on relational dynamics shaped by both genders. How would societies develop values if half the moral voices were missing? Literature and myth often encode female wisdom, as in Greek tragedies where women guide fate and choice. Philosophically, we are left with a world that may be technically functional but emotionally and spiritually impoverished. Historical examples of female-led innovation, from Hildegard of Bingen to Ada Lovelace, would have no analogues. Would art be created purely from logic, devoid of intuitive richness? Religious traditions worldwide show that creation, nurturing, and fertility rituals are often led by women. These spiritual dimensions would disappear. The very concept of family and relational bonding would be redefined. Would love itself exist in its current form? Could the ethical responsibility of life-giving be understood by a society that never experiences it naturally? The human story, in this scenario, becomes one of survival and calculation rather than relational depth and cultural continuity. The existential weight of existence shifts. Without the feminine, humanity must reconsider what it means to be alive, to connect, and to flourish. A society without women would evolve into a narrow emotional and cultural spectrum. The feminine archetype, as Carl Jung describes the anima, guides empathy, intuition, and moral insight. Without it, men may lack the internal counterbalance that shapes compassion and creativity. In Plato's Republic, women were considered capable of philosophical reasoning, showing that gendered inclusion strengthens governance and social structures. Literary works, from Jane Austen to Toni Morrison, highlight how women influence societal cohesion and moral discourse. Religious traditions, from the Virgin Mary in Christianity to Saraswati in Hinduism, underscore the divine feminine as a source of wisdom and inspiration. The absence of women would mean the absence of these spiritual and moral touchstones. Philosophically, Aristotle emphasized that the purpose of life involves cultivating virtue, much of which is learned through relational dynamics with both genders. Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness illustrates how societies without gender differences face unique moral and emotional challenges. Mary Beard's Women in Power documents the invisible contributions of women in leadership. Without these, societal progress might be stunted. In literature, female characters often catalyze transformation, from Shakespearean plays to modern novels. Religions emphasize balance, yin and yang, masculine and feminine, as essential to harmony. A world without women is spiritually lopsided. Ethics, as discussed by Carol Gilligan, depends on relational care, not just abstract rules. In a male-only society, care ethics would be impoverished, potentially replaced by utilitarian logic alone. Creativity, both artistic and technological, might become functional rather than expressive. Philosophically, existentialists like Sartre argue that human freedom is exercised in relational contexts. A lack of feminine perspective limits the dimensions of freedom and understanding. Without women, emotional literacy would shrink, and moral imagination would narrow. The absence of maternal influence disrupts traditions of mentorship, social learning, and ethical modeling. Literary motifs, such as the heroine guiding the hero, vanish. Spiritual practices that honor feminine energy or goddess archetypes disappear. Society risks stagnation, reduced resilience, and limited capacity for empathy. Art, music, and storytelling would be monochromatic, lacking nuance. Human relationships would be transactional rather than relationally rich. This world is efficient, but emotionally flat and culturally impoverished. Identity itself would be incomplete, defined only by one half of humanity. The moral and imaginative canvas would lack depth. Humanity might survive, but it would struggle to flourish. The absence of balance, of duality, leaves the species functional yet spiritually incomplete. Language and art are deeply shaped by the presence of women. The very words for mother, sister, wife, and daughter are absent in this hypothetical world. Literature, from Jane Austen's domestic novels to Alice Walker's essays, celebrates relationships that shape moral imagination. The absence of women erases half of the emotional vocabulary encoded in language. Religious texts, like Proverbs in the Bible, praise maternal wisdom and nurturing, and Hindu scriptures honor goddesses as sources of knowledge and creativity. Philosophically, Aristotle's notion of humans as social animals relies on relational dynamics. Without women, language itself becomes impoverished. Literary archetypes, from Ophelia to Antigone, reflect the feminine influence on morality and ethical action. Ursula K. Le Guin's imaginative work shows how gender absence reshapes narrative structures. In visual art, the muse is absent, leaving creation sterile. Mary Beard emphasizes how women's contributions to culture have often been hidden but foundational. Neuroscience, as in Luann Brisendine's The Female Brain, suggests that female perspectives shape empathy and communication. Without them, dialogue and literature would lack nuance. Mythology across cultures often centers on women as catalysts of creation, from Gaia to Isis. Without these narratives, collective imagination loses depth. Philosophical discourse, from Kant to Hume, depends on relational grounding in shared human experience, which becomes distorted without feminine influence. Music, too, is affected. Harmony reflects relational interplay, which is truncated. The moral imagination shrinks. Ethical dilemmas are perceived more narrowly. Drama, storytelling, and poetry lose half their thematic richness. Social critique becomes one-sided. Humor, irony, and relational tension diminish. The aesthetic experience itself would be flatter, less inspiring. Cultural memory and identity would be incomplete. Art and language reflect life. Without women, much of life remains unseen and unexpressed. Creativity shifts from relational inspiration to purely instrumental function. The human story becomes muted, incomplete, and emotionally constrained. Imagination is curtailed, as half the perspective is permanently missing. In a world without women, emotional intelligence and empathy would be profoundly diminished. Neuroscience shows that hormonal and neural differences influence social bonding and compassion, and these are absent without women. Luann Brisendine's The Female Brain demonstrates how oxytocin and estrogen contribute to empathy and nurturing behaviors. Religions worldwide highlight the importance of compassion, often personified through goddesses or maternal figures. Philosophically, Aristotle believed that moral development requires engagement with diverse perspectives. Without the feminine, moral reasoning is narrowed. Literary works from Jane Austen to Toni Morrison show women guiding emotional understanding in society. Psychologically, the absence of women would increase aggression and conflict, as male socialization often emphasizes competition and dominance. Carl Jung's concept of the anima highlights that the internalized feminine moderates masculine energy. Without it, imbalance prevails. Historical examples show that female leadership often correlates with social cohesion and diplomacy. In spiritual traditions, the feminine is associated with mercy, nurturing, and reconciliation. Ethical frameworks, from Confucian relational ethics to Gilligan's care ethics, would be weakened. Literature often depicts women as mediators and moral guides. Their absence erases these models. Philosophers like Kant emphasize duties toward others. Empathy is essential for understanding these duties. Without relational empathy, society risks utilitarian or instrumental approaches to ethics. Art and literature would lose emotional resonance. Education and mentorship would be less holistic, focusing on technical skill rather than relational growth. The absence of maternal influence disrupts child development, attachment, and social learning. Love, friendship, and collaboration would be diminished in quality. Political systems might favor hierarchy over consensus. Aggression could become normalized without the counterbalance of nurturing influence. Spiritual life would lack dimensions of care and tenderness. Overall, humanity's emotional capacity would be limited, constraining creativity, morality, and social cohesion. In the absence of women, technology would inevitably attempt to fill the void. Machines could raise children, mediate conflict, and even attempt to replicate artistic creation. But can technology truly replicate the emotional intelligence and moral reasoning shaped by the feminine presence? Philosophically, Heidegger warned that technology risks objectifying life, turning it into a calculable resource rather than a relational experience. Literary works, from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to modern AI narratives, explore the limits and dangers of creating life without relational context. Religious traditions emphasize that creation, nurturance, and care are sacred. Technology alone cannot fulfill these roles. Neuroscience shows that attachment, empathy, and social bonding are biologically grounded and relational. These cannot be fully replicated by machines. Ursula K. Le Guin imagines societies where gender absence reshapes culture, showing that relational depth cannot be replaced by structural or artificial solutions. Ethical decision-making in a purely technological society may lack nuance, leading to mechanistic, utilitarian outcomes. Philosophically, Aristotle's notion of telos, the purpose inherent in living beings, cannot be assigned to machines. Literature shows the tragedy when human qualities are replaced by sterile imitation. Historically, female contributions to technology and social cohesion have shaped innovation. Without these, creativity may be efficient but uninspired. Spiritual life would be impoverished, lacking relational context for meaning. Would moral and emotional education be possible in a machine-mediated society? Social bonds would weaken without nurturing intermediaries. Art might exist, but only in form, not emotional depth. Love and intimacy could be simulated, but never fully authentic. Leadership might become algorithmic, lacking empathy. Ethical dilemmas might be solved pragmatically but coldly. Society could function, but the human spirit would be at risk. Literature, philosophy, and religion all warn that reducing life to efficiency diminishes its richness. Creativity might shift toward technical mastery rather than relationally inspired artistry. The essence of being human is relational and emotive, not merely functional. Machines may assist, but they cannot replace the heart of humanity. Identity is always shaped in relation to the other. Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex emphasizes that women define themselves and men in relation to one another. Without women, men would lack this relational mirror. Philosophically, Hegel's master-slave dialectic shows how self-consciousness requires recognition from the other. Absent women, half of that relational dynamic disappears. Literary narratives often rely on feminine characters as catalysts for growth, reflection, and moral insight. Religions emphasize complementary pairs, yin and yang, masculine and feminine, highlighting balance. Without contrast, identity may become static or shallow. Jung's concept of the anima suggests that internal feminine guides men toward self-knowledge. Without it, inner development is stunted. Alice Walker's reflections on maternal legacy emphasize relational roots for growth and culture. Philosophers like Sartre highlight that freedom and authenticity are exercised in interaction with others. A lack of feminine presence limits these possibilities. Art and literature often encode moral and emotional lessons through interactions with women. Historical examples show that female mentorship shapes leadership, creativity, and ethics. Religious parables often involve feminine figures guiding moral insight. Neuroscience indicates that social cognition develops through relational feedback. Half of this input would be absent. The capacity for empathy, reflection, and moral imagination is constrained. Literature, from Shakespeare to Morrison, demonstrates the moral and relational depth women bring. The psychological self would be defined more narrowly. Conflict resolution might be less nuanced. Ethical reasoning may become more rigid. Emotional literacy would be impoverished. Creativity and imagination would lack relational inspiration. Spiritual life loses dimensions of care and interconnectedness. Society would be functional but limited in insight, wisdom, and compassion. Identity, culture, and morality would be profoundly reshaped, reflecting only a partial human experience. History is not just a record of events, it is the inheritance of culture, knowledge, and morality. In a world without women, the maternal line, the channel through which wisdom, traditions, and ethical values are often transmitted, ceases to exist. Philosophically, Aristotle emphasized that humans are social animals, learning virtue through communal and familial interaction. Without women, half of this educational process disappears. Literary examples, from Homer's epics to Toni Morrison's novels, often show maternal figures guiding protagonists morally, socially, and spiritually. Religious traditions, such as the reverence for mothers in Christianity and Hinduism, highlight the importance of maternal guidance in moral and spiritual formation. Alice Walker, in Search of Our Mother's Gardens, explores the unseen but foundational contributions of women to culture and creativity. Without women, a society loses both cultural memory and the continuity of wisdom. Historical matriarchs, queens, and educators demonstrate that women shape not only family structures but entire civilizations. Philosophers such as Confucius stressed the importance of filial piety, where learning from one's mother is central to ethical development. Neuroscience shows that attachment to mothers contributes to emotional regulation and social intelligence. Literature illustrates how maternal absence shapes identity, often leaving gaps in ethical reasoning and emotional depth. Religious myths, from Demeter to the Virgin Mary, convey values that sustain society. In this male-only world, moral traditions may be preserved but lack relational depth and empathy. Political and social systems could become authoritarian, lacking nurturing guidance. Education becomes transactional rather than relational. Creativity may be instrumental, focused on survival or efficiency. Ethical frameworks may prioritize logic over care. Historical knowledge could be skewed, with half of experience ignored. Cultural rituals and celebrations of life would be incomplete. Emotional inheritance, lessons of compassion, resilience, and empathy would be lost. Identity formation is stunted. Philosophical reflections on human flourishing would be limited. The richness of shared wisdom, passed through generations of women, disappears. Legacy is no longer relational, it is functional and unidirectional. Human experience is halved, and the future is built on a narrower foundation. Art and music reflect the interplay of diverse perspectives, emotions, and experiences. In a world without women, the aesthetic range is halved, leaving expression less nuanced. Philosophers like Kant argued that beauty and the sublime arise from relational perception and moral reflection. These are constrained without feminine influence. Literary works, from Shakespeare's plays to contemporary novels, show how women inspire emotional depth and narrative complexity. Religious traditions often associate feminine figures with creativity, such as Saraswati, goddess of learning, and the muses of Greek mythology. Without women, cultural production becomes functional rather than expressive. Musical harmony requires contrasting voices. With only one perspective, melodies flatten. Neuroscience suggests that creativity is socially scaffolded. Interactions with diverse perspectives enhance artistic innovation. Historical examples, from female composers to writers and painters, reveal contributions that expand the emotional and cultural repertoire of society. Ursula K. Le Guin imagined worlds where gender absence alters narrative richness, showing how storytelling itself is shaped by relational dynamics. Philosophically, Aristotle's idea of catharsis in art depends on empathy and identification, which are limited in a single-gender society. The absence of women erases sources of inspiration, guidance, and critique. Literature without female characters loses moral and emotional grounding. Religious symbolism, from Mary Magdalene to goddesses of fertility, informs art, ritual, and imagination. The absence of these archetypes creates a monochromatic cultural experience. Education, storytelling, and mentorship lack relational nuance. Emotional literacy diminishes, leaving society less capable of compassion. Art may still exist, but its depth and resonance are muted. Literature and music become technical rather than soulful. Societies risk cultural stagnation. Ethical and moral imagination is impoverished. Collaboration, dialogue, and relational critique vanish. The spiritual dimension of aesthetic experience is lost. Emotional expression becomes isolated. Creativity becomes utilitarian, and beauty is diminished. Humanity's capacity for awe, empathy, and connection is curtailed. The cultural record reflects only a partial human experience, missing half of its depth and resonance. Ethics is never abstract. It is woven from relationships. When we ask what justice means in a world without women, we confront the deepest cracks in our moral imagination. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, spoke of balance, of the golden mean, as the heart of virtue. Yet balance becomes impossible when half of humanity is missing. The absence of women destabilizes the very categories upon which justice rests: reciprocity, fairness, and care. Plato, in his Republic, described justice as each part of society fulfilling its role in harmony with the others. But without women, entire roles disappear, entire voices are silenced, and harmony fractures into dissonance. The ethical frameworks we have inherited presuppose duality and interdependence. Remove one side, and the moral scaffolding collapses. Spiritual traditions echo this truth. The Bhagavad Gita reminds us that duty, or dharma, persists even when chaos reigns. But what would duty look like when all relational obligations to women vanish? The Tao Te Ching emphasizes yin and yang, inseparable opposites. Justice itself may be imagined as such a polarity, strength balanced by compassion, reason by empathy. With women gone, the yin is stripped from the yang, and justice is distorted. Morality risks becoming rigid, transactional, and incomplete. In literature, characters embody ethical struggles, and their stories remind us that morality is lived, not theorized. Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness explored a society without fixed genders, revealing that ethics itself shifts when identity changes. Charlotte Perkins' Gilman's Herland imagined a world with only women, where cooperation replaced competition. Inverting her vision into one without women suggests a harsher ethic, one stripped of relational care. The question is not only what rules remain, but whether morality itself can survive imbalance. Without women, would ethics reduce to power and enforcement rather than reciprocity and care? Would justice become a hollow shell, unable to account for half of humanity's absence? Or would the absence provoke new ethical systems, stripped of balance but reshaped by necessity? These questions remind us that ethics is not a static set of rules, but a living practice, and without women, that practice would lose its anchor. Culture is memory, and memory is carried forward through stories. To imagine a world without women is to imagine the erasure of countless voices, myths, and creative visions. Virginia Woolf's Orlando suggests that identity and creativity are never fixed, that they bend and shift like time itself. Without women, that fluidity collapses into rigidity. Memory narrows instead of expands. Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness shows us that even language struggles to convey worlds outside of gendered norms. The absence of women would not only silence voices, but also fracture the imagination that language makes possible. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland offered a utopia of women alone, where storytelling celebrated cooperation, renewal, and life. Imagine the reverse. A world without women, where myth bends toward survival, conquest, and control. Sacred texts remind us of the symbolic power of women's voices. In the Bible's Proverbs, wisdom is personified as female, calling from the streets with guidance and truth. What happens when that call vanishes? Myths would lose their balance, art its depth, and stories their breadth. Aristotle argued that humans are narrative creatures. We come to know ourselves through the stories we tell. Without women, the human story becomes half erased, a ghost tale with missing chapters. Plato understood myth as a vehicle for truth. Without women, truth itself becomes impoverished, bound by silence where dialogue once flourished. Cultural memory is fragile, and literature preserves its vitality. Without the voices of mothers, daughters, and creators, culture risks becoming monochrome. Imagination fractures because it depends on dialogue, on tension, on exchange between perspectives. With only one gender-shaping stories, the creative field narrows. The result is not only loss but distortion. Culture may continue, but it would echo with absences, haunted by stories that were never told. Family is the first social structure, and without women, family as we know it collapses. Motherhood vanishes, kinship networks fracture, and the bonds of intimacy and care are severed. Goethe Lerner's The Creation of Patriarchy reminds us that power has always been shaped by gendered dynamics. Remove women, and the structures of power are not only unbalanced, but exposed as fragile constructs. Patriarchal systems might initially appear to strengthen in the absence of women, but in truth, they crumble, for they are defined by the control of what no longer exists. Plato's Republic envisions society as a web of roles and relationships. Without women, entire functions disappear. Care, reproduction, and relational authority vanish, leaving hollow frameworks behind. Aristotle's idea of the polis, the community as essential for human flourishing, falters when half of its citizens are missing. Social bonds thin, authority distorts, and meaning disintegrates. Spiritual texts push us deeper. The Bhagavad Gita emphasizes dharma, the duties one must uphold to sustain cosmic order. Yet what dharma remains when duties to mothers, sisters, and daughters are erased? The Tao Te Ching speaks of balance as the essence of governance, of leadership through harmony. Without women, governance risks tipping into tyranny, power stripped of restraint. The Bible, in Genesis, frames creation as male and female together, co-laboring in life itself. Remove one, and the vision of wholeness shatters. Literature dramatizes what philosophy and religion theorize. Gilman's Herland shows cooperation as the foundation of society. Invert it, and you glimpse hierarchy without counterbalance. Le Guin's worlds remind us that kinship must be reimagined when gender categories shift. Without women, kinship loses not only balance but its capacity for renewal. Families wither into isolated individuals, societies bend toward collapse, and the very possibility of continuity erodes. A world without women is a world without sustainable structures, where power survives only as an illusion over emptiness. At the core of this inquiry is the human condition itself. To ask what happens in a world without women is to ask what it means to be human. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex shows us that identity is relational, defined not in isolation, but in dialogue. Without women, men too lose part of their identity, for the contrast and complementarity that shape human meaning vanish. Judith Butler's Gender Trouble reminds us that gender is performative, enacted through repeated roles. With women gone, half the performance collapses, leaving the play of humanity incomplete. Philosophy frames this absence in terms of justice and virtue. Aristotle's balance disappears, Plato's ideal state falters, and the ethical frameworks of the ancients reveal their dependency on gendered wholeness. Spiritual traditions deepen this insight. The Tao Te Ching insists that yin cannot exist without yang. Remove one, and existence tilts into imbalance. The Bible's Genesis presents humanity as created male and female together, calling this unity very good. Without women, the goodness of creation fractures. Literature reveals the emotional truth of this loss. Woolf's Orlando captures the fluidity of identity, which depends on the interplay of gendered experience. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness dares to imagine a society beyond gender binaries, but in doing so shows how strange and incomplete human imagination feels without gendered difference. Gilman's Herland presents wholeness without men, but its mirror opposite suggests an unendurable fracture without women. The human condition has always depended on balance, on dialogue, on complementarity. Existence itself depends not on one or the other, but on the interplay between both. Without women, humanity would endure biologically only for a time, but spiritually, culturally, and morally, it would be unrecognizable. Humanity is more than survival, it is balance, meaning, and relation. Without women, that meaning dissolves into fragments, leaving existence without its wholeness. The journey we have taken in this video is not an isolated thought experiment, but one that draws deeply on philosophy, literature, and spirituality. These resources extend the conversation, offering perspectives that challenge, expand, and complicate the questions raised here. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex provides a groundbreaking philosophical framework, reminding us that womanhood has been historically constructed and defined in contrast to manhood. Without women, her insights shift dramatically, forcing us to ask what categories remain. Judith Butler's gender trouble then unsettles even the foundations of identity, showing us that gender is performance. If half of those performances were erased, Butler would argue, the scripts of human life would need rewriting. Gerda Lerner's The Creation of Patriarchy pulls us back into history, tracing how patriarchal systems were not inevitable, but crafted, making the absence of women a thought experiment that reveals the fragility of those constructions. Classical philosophy also helps frame this inquiry. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics envisions human flourishing through balance and virtue, which becomes precarious in a world stripped of gender reciprocity. Plato's Republic interrogates justice, the structure of society, and the search for truth, questions that loom large when one gender vanishes. Together, these philosophical voices anchor our reflection in critical frameworks for ethics, justice, and meaning. Literature provides another dimension. Virginia Woolf's Orlando dissolves the boundaries of gender and time, showing us how fluid identity might become in a world without women. Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness imagines an alien society where gender is mutable, inviting us to picture relationships beyond binary norms. Charlotte Perkins' Gilman's Herland envisions a utopian world composed entirely of women, offering an eerie mirror to our current reflection. What happens when only men remain, or when women vanish altogether? Literature, in this sense, becomes philosophy in motion, embodied and imaginative. Spiritual traditions, too, carry timeless insights. The Bhagavad Gita teaches duty, action, and balance even in the face of immense loss. Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching calls us back to harmony, to the recognition that opposites, like masculine and feminine, create the wholeness of the Tao. The Bible, particularly in Genesis and Proverbs, reflects on the roles of men and women in creation and wisdom, perspectives that grow especially poignant when imagining an alternate history stripped of one side of humanity. These texts remind us that spirituality has always grappled with the interplay of gender, identity, and cosmic order. Modern tools help us bridge past and present. Podcasts like Philosophy Talk bring these questions into contemporary dialogue, making philosophy accessible to everyday listeners. Online resources such as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy provide living, evolving scholarship that allows anyone to explore feminist philosophy, ethics, and the philosophy of gender with depth and rigor. Taken together, these sources illuminate the stakes of our inquiry. Philosophy sharpens our concepts, literature stretches our imagination, and spirituality grounds us in questions of meaning. The absence of women is not only a scenario to imagine, but a lens through which to re-examine history, justice, and the fragile balance of humanity. By engaging these works, we carry forward the conversation and continue the philosophical task of asking what it means to live, love, and create in a world that is never whole without its fullness. We conclude this inquiry not with answers, but with deeper questions. To imagine a world without women is to confront the fragility of humanity's foundations. It shows us that wholeness cannot exist without balance, and that identity, justice, and meaning are built on reciprocity. Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, and Gerda Lerner remind us through philosophy that gender is constructed, relational, and historically contingent. Without women, those constructions crumble, and their absence reveals the interdependence we often overlook. Aristotle and Plato frame justice and virtue in ways that collapse under imbalance, showing us that the ideals of philosophy depend on the fullness of humanity. Literature amplifies this truth. Virginia Woolf, Ursula K. Le Guin and Charlotte Perkins Gilman use story and imagination to reveal what happens when gender boundaries dissolve or shift. Their works remind us that the absence of women is not only theoretical, but deeply experiential, shaping how culture, art, and imagination function. Spiritual wisdom underscores this. The Bhagavad Gita teaches us to act with duty even amid loss. The Tao Te Ching insists on harmony through opposites, and the Bible presents humanity as complete only in the unity of male and female. Taken together, these resources tell us that the question is not whether humanity could survive without women. It might, in a biological or mechanical sense, but whether humanity could still call itself whole. Survival without meaning is emptiness. Existence without balance is shadow. The task we inherit from this reflection is to honor the fullness of humanity in our present world, to value not only the presence of women, but the reciprocity, imagination, and balance that they represent. A world without women is not a future we face, but a mirror held up to remind us of what we must never take for granted. The fullness of humanity, the richness of culture, the balance of justice, and the beauty of creation all depend on honoring the interplay of difference. To be human is to be whole, and to be whole requires both.